can hear me way in the back of the room, would you raise your hand, please? Didn't get it on the far end. Okay. Well, we'll do the best we can. I have lived, I have labored, and I have loved. To love and to labor is the sum of living. Now the day is far spent, and the night is at hand, and the time draweth nigh when a woman shall rest from her labors. But still shall be love, and she shall enter into rest through that which is light and life and love. We have come together from different places. We are at different stages in our journey through life. Our paths have varied. We look at life in different ways. One thing we have in common, at one point or another, and to some degree or other, our lives have touched and been touched by the life of Susan. And so we have turned aside from our accustomed ways and gathered here to give expression to the thoughts and feelings that well up in us at this time of loss. Susan's death has cut across the lives of all of us. I have two readings I'd like to share this morning. The first is from the Hebrew Scriptures, Micah chapter 6, verses 6 through 8. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before God with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams and 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? Second reading is from Robert T. Weston's Exaltation. I picked up a handful of sand. It trickled through my fingers, and I could not pick it up again. I plucked a flower, and the petals fell. Lo, where they had been, already there took shape a tiny seed, but it was no more permanent than the petals. I sought to hold it, and it shriveled up and ceased to be. I planted a ripe seed, and it split, and where it had been green sprouted, and where it had been a green sprout appeared. But the seed decayed. The green sprout grew, a thing of beauty, sent down roots, sent out leaves, budded, flowered, bore fruit, decayed, and was itself a withered thing. I could not even keep the ripe seed. Yet each in its time had possessed its own peculiar beauty. All things change. Nothing remains the same. Spring comes, fills the heart with song, and is gone. Summer, with its invitation to leisure, is upon us. and hardly have we taken hold of it, but the ripe fruit of autumn is in our hands. Either we take it and enjoy it, or it too decays. Then the sharp breath of winter and snow crystals are flying past us before the last ripe fruit is gone. Lo, each in its time, each life in its every moment. The baby, the child, the youth, the lover, the parent, the aged is at its ultimate state in every moment and passes on. Pluck this moment then as you would a precious flower. Share it as if it were love, and let it go. Beauty and wonder lie all about you even now. They too, even as you, are never final, but always in the process of both being and becoming. Take then each moment as the perfect gift of life, knowing that you shall no more be able to hold it as it is than what has already passed. Even as you let go, another and different moment comes, to be enjoyed or lost. When Susie was applying for a job at the National Security Agency, they asked her, have you ever been part of an extremist organization? Susie replied, well, I was a Republican in high school. Whenever asked for parental advice, she said, have a Chinese woman come and move in with you. And one of the great campaigns of her life was to authorize, legalize unrelated donors. And she made this delightfully Unitarian comment. If you believe in the brotherhood of man, there are no unrelated donors. These little witticisms, the anecdotes that we all have, are the very essence of Susan. So we're going to have a series of speakers, starting with Susan's children. As it turns out, the order is youngest to oldest, but that was not the criteria on which it was made, the decision was made. And then we're going to have some professional colleagues speak, and then I will share some comments that came in, and then finally I'll have my say. So that's sort of the program. Sit back, be comfortable, and let us begin by welcoming Michael Molitor.
Can you hear me? Okay. Writing a tribute to my mom was really difficult for obvious reasons. For instance, I guess the biggest reason is that there's this tragic loss that we're all experiencing right now. But another reason why it was so difficult is that it's just really hard to capture what was so amazing about my mom in words. So everyone's going to come up here to speak, and they're going to try to capture her somehow linguistically anyway. And they're going to talk about her brilliance and her selflessness and courageousness and all these other qualities. But there was also a sort of immaterial quality about my mom that was just sort of impossible to really verbalize. Something that underscored her intelligence in a way that went beyond language. So this is definitely not a word that does this quality justice, but the closest word that I could think of was that she was magic. And she was just magic in this way that made her unlike anyone else you might meet. And I had the fortune of having her as my mom, meaning that I got to have this otherworldly influence on my own life and upbringing. And it's hard to imagine any other mom letting their kid randomly raise his hand in class to say, "My mom said she's an alien from another planet." Rather than feel embarrassed when I told her about this, my mom was proud of the non sequitur that I presented in my class. One of my fondest memories of her, which I tell my wife Danielle about all the time, was that when the family would go walking somewhere, my mom would just start dancing out of the blue, to make us laugh. It wasn't like a smooth, elegant sort of tango. It was more like a sporadic, jerky thing. Like she was overcome with ecstatic energy, a force from another dimension, or just immeasurable love for her family. So on the way to ice cream or dinner or walking around an outdoor shopping mall in Venice, Italy, on a summer night she might start dancing with a huge grin on her face like, I mean, I don't even feel great doing the dance because I feel like I couldn't capture it exactly. And it was sort of the same energy she used to vaguely gesture for salt or some other thing at the dinner table like this. No matter what the food item was, she would just, ask if you could pass the, I don't know. And I can't do that either very well. I mean, it's hard. So you could easily say that she couldn't think of the word for salt at the moment because her head was lost in the clouds, which would be accurate in a way, but in another way it was more like she was part of her was in an entirely different realm altogether. So if she said something to you and left the room before she was finished with her sentence, trailing off so you couldn't hear what she said, it was because part of her was on a lofty mission in another universe. And this was a universe filled with imaginary friends, including people who didn't even speak any of the same languages she spoke. You all know she spoke or understood at least part of 5 different languages, but none of those languages were Dutch, which was what one pair of her make-believe friends apparently spoke, according to her. I'm assuming for her this was a mental exercise in speaking the universal language that all people share, regardless of the country they're from. This universe that she partially occupied was also one where she imagined that back then President George W. Bush might crash land the Air Force One into the Bolivian rainforest, where he'd be rescued by volunteers at our clinic, who would forever change his outlook so that when he returned to the White House, he would implement a life-altering program that would bring about world peace. Because she so often occupied this other realm, even while walking around our consensus reality, it wasn't altogether surprising to hear that she believed in ghosts. I think I asked her how she could possibly believe in such a superstitious thing for which there's no empirical evidence, the lifeblood of her medical career, empirical evidence. She said she believed in them because she wanted to know that life went on after death, and that in the afterlife maybe she could be a ghost so that she could keep living. She loved life so much that she never wanted it to stop. I guess, though, the most magical thing about her was the love she had for all of us. This, too, is best expressed in a nonverbal manner. I remember when I was probably about 18 or so, I was sitting in our TV room, and she walked behind me and tousled my hair just like she did when I was a little kid. It was probably the first time she'd done so since I became a teenager and shunned all physical affection. I could feel shooting from her fingertips the immeasurable love she had for me. When I got back to Chicago the last time we saw her in the hospital, it was immediately apparent that she wasn't there. It was in what was once her body. I don't know what I believe about any of that stuff, the afterlife, but I would like to believe that she either had already left for that other dimension before I got there, or had become a ghost, or something better that I can't even imagine. Regardless of where she went, I know that she made this world a more magical place, and my life a more magical one. I didn't say in the beginning, I'm Michael Molicho, I'm Susan's youngest son. Up next, I think, is her oldest kid, her daughter, Tamara.
So I've inherited her height, so I don't know if I can thanks, Dad. We'll see if I can get through this, because listening to that makes it a little hard to start. But I think, everybody kind of is saying a similar thing, that there is no one else like Susan Ho. There might be people who are as generous or as brilliant or as quirky, but no one that kind of encompasses it all to be the extraordinary person that we all knew. I'm sure that all of us are in agreement that my mom was taken from us far too early. For some reason, I find myself being frustrated with karma, even though I don't think I believe in karma or ever did, but I keep saying it's not fair. How could somebody who dedicated her life to taking care of so many people get so sick? It's not fair. How could somebody who was dedicating her life to organ transplantation need a kidney and a lung? And for that matter, a woman who wore sunscreen every day in the winter in Chicago to go from the house to the garage had to have radiation treatments for skin cancer. It's not fair. But I think at least all of us can agree that my mom wasn't just alive for almost 73 years, but that she lived. Whatever it was that she wanted to do, she did, no matter how insurmountable a task it might have seemed to anyone else. It really pained me to know that she wasn't able to retire and spend her golden years gallivanting around and saving the world with my dad. But I know that her biggest disappointment is that she didn't get to retire and move to Florida, not for my kids and me, or the beaches, or Disney World, but because she really wanted to take up residence in a state where her vote would count against Trump. Growing up with Susan Ho was a little different than a lot of my friends' families. As a kid, I used to sort of brag to my friends that we didn't have any rules at my house. We didn't have silly rules, like we didn't have a bedtime. We didn't get in trouble if we were swearing or something like that. In fact, the only two rules I really remember her telling us all was that you have to wear a seatbelt and you have to use a condom. That covered most of the big stuff. Even though we didn't have those really strict household rules, and most of our religious education kind of came from Jesus Christ Superstar and Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. But even with that, despite that, I think that she and my dad instilled values of compassion and tolerance and charity and equality. And she taught us those things not by a book or a sermon or anything, but by modeling them with her attitudes and her words and her relationships and her actions. Although she wasn't very religious, like David said, she grew up in the Unitarian Church. And she used to always say, well, being a Unitarian means you believe in the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. But the fatherhood of God part's optional. I think, like her religious interpretation, she always had a unique perspective and a witty line to accompany it. I was reading some of the things she wrote recently, and she described being a doctor. And she said, being a doctor is the best job in the world. You'll be present at miracles, maybe in the front row. It's a privilege to be someone's doctor. You see them at their most vulnerable. Someday you will be a patient. And then she elaborates in typical Susan Ho fashion, being a doctor means having to dialyze bin Laden. The Susan train of thought. My mom always claimed that any storyteller had the right to embellish a story at least 10% to make it more entertaining, and she was great at doing that. And the funny thing is that telling stories about her doesn't require embellishment, because anything that she was doing, anything about her, was pretty remarkable all on its own. In fact, I think we know that nobody could tell her that she couldn't do something. Her mother, my grandmother Marmar, once told her that she would never be as good at languages as her older sister Anne, who was a Spanish teacher. And as Mike said, and we all know, she went on to go learn to speak a total of 5 languages. Her Chinese was so good that she was often mistaken for a native Chinese speaker, at least over the phone, until they saw this little white woman show up. Her last name helped the confusion. But anyway, so when we grew up sort of eating Chinese and using chopsticks, and she always had cooking chopsticks instead of other utensils, and she really had an appreciation for all cultures around the world, and she took us and we traveled all around the world. And I mean, I feel like she had this kind of fascination and interest and engagement with every culture all over the place, except for like middle class white America, which was sort of dull. And that I recently learned in a few different ways that the reasons she learned to speak Arabic were very interesting. So my dad told me that when she turned 50, she just sort of wondered whether she could still learn a new language. So she thought she should, find out. And then I think she had and I remember this, but it's a little hazy, I was young. She had a fellow that was named Al, whose brother was unjustly imprisoned in Syria, I think. And I remember always talking about how she was sort of doing all these different things, writing letters and calling people and trying to get Al's brother out of jail. And then I saw something where she said that that was the main reason she picked Arabic as the language she was going to learn. And then my brother, when I told that to my brother, he said, well, wait a minute, I thought the reason she did this because she wanted to speak to as many different people as she could around the world, and she already knew English and Chinese and Spanish, so let's add Arabic. And she's getting pretty close to most people. So I think sometimes we would suggest to my mom that she couldn't do something or she shouldn't do something, and that just provoked her to try. And that sometimes led to doing something that wasn't so brilliant. Just before my son Evan was born in 2009, my parents were down there for it, and she decided she was going to race our 90-pound German short-haired dog, Scully, across our pool, just because. And so they decided they were going to race, and they jumped in the pool, and the dog landed on her hand, and so they didn't get to race because I think she hurt her hand pretty badly. And she thought about stopping when we went to the hospital the next morning for my son, that she thought about stopping to get an x-ray on the way, but she didn't, she waited. And she was very proud that she was able to sort of help me deliver Evan, even though she had a broken hand, which she found out later when she got the x-ray in Chicago. I think my husband Brian and my daughter Maya like to tell me that my husband tries to tell me that I've inherited this quality of being sort of the tenacity of the easiest way to get me to try something that I might think is difficult is to suggest that I can't do it. But I'll take it if tenacity is what I inherit from Susan Ho. That's pretty good. I think in addition to that tenacity, my mom has passed on some other qualities to me and my children. My daughter Maya wants to be a pastry chef when she grows up. And I think this interest was sparked when every holiday that we got together, she would bake pies, and I helped her when I was little, and I can do the pies, but Maya really loved to do the pies with her, and her favorite dessert is cherry pie that she made with my mom. My mom was a great cook, across the board, and she was always willing to try something new. So if somebody was coming over who was a vegetarian or kept kosher, she would certainly go way out of her way to make sure she accommodated and did everything she needed. Or if somebody just mentioned that they liked chocolate lava cake or lemon meringue pie or something, that was her next goal, was to make that for them. Over the last few years, I've found myself displaying these sort of idiosyncratic behaviors that made me say, oh no, I'm turning into my mom. But my daughter and my husband tell me that I have this tendency to start talking to them and then continue talking as I wander out of the room and not realize that it's kind of hard to have a conversation when you're walking out of the room. And then I've noticed that, I don't like carrying a purse very much, and I almost never do it, and so I keep putting cash in my pockets. And then when I empty my pockets or my bag, I put the cash in all these different places in my house where I'm emptying my pockets. And I saw these crumpled up pieces like bills, and I was oh my God, this is ridiculous. I'm turning into my mom. What am I doing? She always has crumpled up coins in every coat pocket and backpack and everywhere else. And then I find myself doing that gesture across the dinner table, like Mike was saying, for, past the whatever it is. And but now I feel like instead of panicking that I'm turning into my mom, I take some comfort in knowing that even though she's not here with me, at least a part of her lives on in me and all of my children and all of her children and grandchildren. That's it.
I'm Ethan, the middle child. I think this is the IV pole that we use anytime my mom did get an infection or something.
It is an IV pole. So thank you all for coming out here to celebrate the life of my mom. Clearly this needed to be a celebration of life because she just led one of the lives that we all hope to live up to. She was a tiny lady, but pound for pound, she was one of the world's greatest humans. I've heard a lot of stories over the last few weeks, and so many aren't, your mom was a great person. It was, your mom changed my life. And so she lived for this world and not just for herself. She had this story of being on the elevator at the hospital, and an older man was slowly approaching the elevator, and she was in a hurry. She was on rounds that day, and she actually thought about hitting that closed door button. She lectured herself, "You're a kidney donor. You went through surgery. You can hold a door open for somebody." She thought that going through this surgery, this grand gesture, was so much easier than doing these kind day-to-day things every day. And that was what you should truly strive for, is those moments of being kind at every moment. So I was shocked that the thought to hit that closed door button ever crossed her mind. My mom had selfish thoughts. Maybe she just invented this scenario for a talk. I wouldn't put that past her. Maybe she truly had that thought. Maybe she wasn't as kind and selfless every moment of every day. But man, she could pull off a grand gesture. We know the big ones. She didn't just treat kidney disease, she donated her kidney. She didn't just volunteer, she started a clinic in Bolivia. She didn't just write a letter to a senator, she started a foundation to sponsor, raise funds, and support Dadi Ding to come to the United States to get care for her kidney disease and get a kidney transplant when the care wasn't available in China. So those are the big ones, but she had so many others that would be grand for so many, but for her, they were just in the minor gesture column. She funded college for those that couldn't afford it. She opened the doors to our home for anyone that needed it. When it wasn't convenient for Dadi to dialyze at a center, she put a dialysis machine in our back room for Dadi to dialyze. And now it's trending on Twitter that she dialyzed the entire city of Chicago. So she collected medications and gave those out to those in need. She gave jobs to some of her patients' kids so they could earn extra money to help fund the family. She was part of that brotherhood of man and always lived for others. We went on a trip to Israel, and my mom looked at the Sea of Galilee, and her first thought was to swim across. She had already swam across the hummocks and inland in the Atlantic Ocean in Rhode Island. She was pregnant with my sister at the time, but she swam across that. So while in Israel, she found someone to row the boat next to her, and she headed off to swim across the 8 miles across. I got to ride in the boat with the captain. My job was to hold on to the chocolate, and every time my mom needed some chocolate, she would pull up to the side of the boat, and I would feed her while she was swimming across the water. There was a point where the current was so strong that for 45 minutes, she made no progress. The current was that strong, we just sat there, sitting in that one same spot. The guy that was rowing the boat was like, "Ma'am, you're not going anywhere. You should get back in the boat." And you all probably know she did not listen to a word that man said. So she kept swimming and kept swinging and determined to make it across, and obviously we did. We made it the rest of the way. And so a few years later, we were in Italy, and she saw Lake Lugano, and she had to jump into that body of water. And so I took it upon myself, so I had to go through with her because I wanted to be as tough as my mom. So this past April, she's been in and out of the hospital for over these last several months. But she had a brief trip where she got to make it home for a few days. And I happened to be in town, and I got to come home. She was so weak from that last hospitalization that she wasn't really getting around very well. And she asked me, "How will you remember me? Will you remember me swimming across the Sea of Galilee, or will you remember me like this?" I told her I would remember all of it. I would remember her getting 1,000 hugs from 1,000 Bolivians during an anniversario at the clinic. I would remember her inability to drive both cars and scooters. Inability. I would remember her hiking up Ayers Rock despite her fear of heights. I would remember her leaning way, way over like this to try and guide the bowling ball to get a strike. And I'm not sure she ever got it. I'll remember the hospital beds, the oxygen. I'll remember the duct tape on the oxygen because my cat bit through the tubing. I will remember the most intelligent delirium I've ever seen when she described part of a chapter she wrote about tacrolimus-induced encephalopathy while she was suffering from tacrolimus. That was for the doctors in the audience. I'll remember her love of medicine. I'll remember her emails. Found the DVDs in the basement. Just got a pulmonary biopsy. Love, Mom. I'll remember her typing out my thoughts as I paced back and forth writing a history paper for Dr. Goldberg's class. I was walking back and forth saying my thoughts out loud while she typed. And of course, this was due the next day. I'll remember her screaming, "You idiot!" when I nearly fell off a mountain because I was being an idiot. I'll remember when I was the clinic coordinator at the clinic. I was driving a car full of doctors to the clinic on the weekend. I got a call from my mom saying they needed to stop at one of the smaller hospitals nearby because a teenage girl had come in and was vomiting up blood. As I pulled up to the hospital, I saw this tiny blue truck that belonged to Maria, our clinic nurse, coming from the other direction. As it turned into the lot, I saw my mom wearing her standard gray clinic vest, standing in the bed of the truck holding up a bag of saline, while the girl was lying in the bed of the truck getting the fluids. My mom and the clinic team brought her into the hospital. And in Bolivia, you have to give blood to get blood. So for this girl to get blood, we had to get folks to donate blood for her to get. So we grabbed everyone that had come with us and berated them until they gave blood for this girl. I rescued that girl that day. So Mom, I will remember you as a superhero. Thank you.
Well, I'm Douglas from Bolivia. The universe confabulated, so my good friend and brother Moises Mercado, or through him, I met Susan many years ago. And in order to do good things and become family. Susan was the most altruistic person I ever met, and many of us are now better people for having had her in our lives. All of her actions met the strictest definition of altruism, a voluntary behavior which has a cause and has been motivated by the desire to benefit other people. How else could we explain that she built a clinic in the Amazon in South America to help the sick people? The only possible answer is compassion, something that, for some reason, Susan seemed to have more than others. Susan was the kind of person who fought for the people's right to health, regardless of race or creed. She offered to undergo surgery to have one of her own healthy kidneys removed to be transplanted into a very sick stranger. Why was she willing to do this if so many other people don't? Throughout the United States, there are fewer than 2,000 Americans who have donated a kidney to a stranger. So little. But I must add that in what Susan has made the difference, it is the fact that she has been more compassionate than the average. And what is even more important, she was compassionate and altruistic not only towards the people of her own intimate circle of friends and relatives. Because feeling compassion for the people you like and with those you identify with is not extraordinary. Susan did it with people who were outside her social circle and even beyond her broader circle of acquaintances and who lived thousands of miles away. That's what I call extraordinary compassion. In Bolivia, she has left a legacy that will endure over time and that will continue her work of healing the sick and saving lives of the poor. And whenever I asked her about what motivated her to be so special, her answer was always there was nothing special about her. She considered herself the same as everyone else. Can you believe that? Susan never thought of herself as she was the center of things, or that she was better or intrinsically more important than others. I think the best descriptions of Susan's way of being is humility. There was never anyone more or less worthy of her attention and compassion. And I think this is what really distinguished her from the average person. Susan managed to turn our world into a better and more human place. Susan changed many lives for the better and lived her life the way she should. How many of us can say the same? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Andy Levy. I'm a kidney doctor at Tufts Medical Center, where Susan was a fellow in training and an attending physician 2 years ahead of me. I stayed at Tufts after Susan and Mark moved to Chicago and have been there for the next 37 years. From the time we met, Susan was an inspiration to me. I understood that she was always right, and the right thing to do was to support her. I was never brave enough to be the leader in her causes, but I was always willing to follow. I'll briefly recount 2 stories which you've already heard about, where she helped me do the right thing. I was a new director of the dialysis unit at Tufts. Susan brought Dadi Ding to our new peritoneal dialysis program and encouraged me to negotiate a contract with our dialysis supplier that would ensure free, sufficient supplies for Dadi until she received her kidney transplant. Early in my career as a transplant nephrologist, Susan and I laid out together the arguments in favor of living unrelated kidney transplantation, which at that time had been discarded in favor of living related and deceased donor transplantation, and which we were able eventually to publish in the New England Journal of Medicine. And later the field adopted this technique, and each of us became kidney donors. As you know, Susan to her patient, and I to my wife Roberta, who is here. The night before the surgery, we received a package from Susan, delivered express, which was a CD, so I could listen to Bonnie Taylor from Footloose sing "Holding Out for a Hero," and Louis Armstrong sing and play "When the Saints Go Marching In." Susan, thank you so much for being an inspiration and for being a great leader by your own example, a hero and a saint. Roberta and I are so grateful that you were in our lives. To Mark, the children, the grandchildren, may you take some comfort in knowing that Susan will always live on in the hearts of so many.
Good morning. My name is Andy, and I met Susan almost 30 years ago at Rush when I was an internal medicine resident and then worked with her closely as a renal fellow. Over the past few weeks, I've been flooded with so many wonderful memories of Susan and laughs we shared over the years. As I reminisced, I felt so grateful and privileged that Susan was my mentor and my friend. And I'm sure all of you here today feel equally privileged and have your own special memories of Susan as we witness together her amazing life. I will treasure forever the years I worked with Susan, and I'd like to share some of those early memories with you today. As I reminisced, I felt, Susan taught me so many things and inspired me to be the best physician and person I could be. We would spend long days and nights in the hospital. I would never see her tired or grumpy. She was always fully engaged, a superior intellect, boundless energy, and a sense of humor that would often lighten the load of a difficult day. When we'd see patients together, no matter how busy we were, Susan never appeared rushed, always putting the patient at ease with her kind and gentle approach. In that moment, the patient had her complete and undivided attention. Susan taught me to be more compassionate and to better understand the needs of the whole patient. Back then, it could be as simple as Susan providing bus fare for the patient to get home. But as we've heard today, it significantly evolved to starting a free clinic in Bolivia with Mark and Douglas. Susan taught me the power of lipstick. So one day Susan came to the office, a bit disheveled, and told me that she had slipped on ice as she was walking to her car, falling, striking the back of her head. I asked Susan, "Did you lose consciousness?" She said, "Maybe." So I called radiology, and they worked during that morning for a head CT. I saw her a few hours later, and this time, she had applied lipstick fresh. She was smiling. She looked great. I asked her, "What's the results of the CT?" She evaded my question, said, "Mark's out of town. I really need to get home to the kids after school." And I was on call, and she said, I'll see you tomorrow morning. So she left. Then about an hour later, she called me, and she goes, "Actually, my CT showed a skull fracture. Could you explain to Tamara how she should check on me tonight? If Tamara has any questions, you're on call. Can she call you?" So, needless to say, I was surprised by the update, especially since Susan had the results before leaving the hospital and driving herself home. But I could picture Susan smiling on the other end of the phone, knowing that she short-circuited all my medical judgment with a fresh application of lipstick. Later, Susan would freely admit that that was her plan. Learning nephrology was only part of what made my fellowship so extraordinary. Susan and I shared a passion for horses. And I learned on the first day of my fellowship there was an unexpected bonus. I could ride Susan's horse, Mel, whenever I wanted. At that point, I thought I hit the jackpot of all renal fellowships. Susan opened her heart to me through her home, family, and friends. Her love for Mark was palpable. But I learned even more throughout the years how truly incredible their love was for each other. Susan would often share regularly observations and comments of Tamara, Ethan, and Michael. So delighted by their clever quips and insights. The Molichow home was like nothing I had experienced before. It was a home that welcomed everyone. It was the perfect balance of unconditional love sprinkled with a little enchanting chaos. It wasn't a quiet house. It was roaring with activity. Friends visiting from around the world, lively discussions, multiple languages being spoken, the smell of delicious food being prepared, and Dadi doing home dialysis. This was my first glimpse of a truly rich life. By the end of my fellowship, Susan was my superhero in so many ways, but at times a paradox. Kind of a Mother Teresa wearing fabulous jewelry. Someone took a photo of us in the hospital standing side by side, and I was shocked to see how much taller I was than Susan. I was with Susan the first time I saw the photo, and over the past 2 years I felt I was walking with a giant among physicians. So I looked at Susan and I said, "I'm a lot taller than you." Susan smiled and looked rather confused that this was my new revelation. Of course, for me, in my mind's eye, Susan was a giant then. She only grew bigger throughout the years. With her unending generosity, numerous achievements we've heard about today, astonishing altruism, and unwavering courage. So as we all know, other than Susan's height, there was absolutely nothing small about Susan. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Anil Bidani. I'm the Chief of Nephrology at Loyola. And as I hear the tributes and talk to people assembled in this room, I realize how inadequate our words are often are, both to convey our sense of sorrow and loss, as well as to describe a souls as luminous as Susan, radiating truly extraordinary generosity and goodwill towards the less fortunate and those who needed or sought out her help. Although I had known her and heard about her acts of altruism as a member of the nephrology community in Chicago, it was only after I, with the help of my chairman, Pat Fahey, recruited her to Loyola, to our transplant program in 2000, that I had the privilege of knowing her as a friend, a colleague, and a witness to her exceptional life and spirit. I will not try to recount her professional achievements or the numerous awards and honors that she received. During her time at Loyola, a lot of you have already talked about some of them, and more can testify to that, or even the innumerable acts of kindness and generosity during these years. But I do wish to state the great job she did mentoring our fellows, junior faculty, and indeed all of us in how to be a decent human being and a caring physician. Through her example of kindness, gentleness, compassion, combined with strength and tenacity. Indeed, all of our lives have been enriched and inspired by knowing her and working with her, and in the process, getting to know Mark and the rest of her remarkable family. This has been particularly true while seeing her struggle through her own through her illness with courage and grace, while maintaining her sense of humor, which could be mischievous and sly, but always captured the moment perfectly. Let me end by stating something that I have said often before, The world needs all the Susan O's it can find. And we at Loyola were very fortunate for having her for as long as we did. Thanks.
It's not pretty, but we get it done. And these are the promised comments that have come in from friends near and far. The first is from Maggie Beyer, who was Susan's classmate at Harvard. Your darling, courageous wife, mother, and grandmother has given us so much joy, support, wisdom, and wit for the past 55 years that her death leaves a bigger and more painful chasm in our histories than even a close relative. Susie was always there for both of us, through the giddy ups and the gruesome downs, with insight and patience like nobody else. And all served up with that dry, wisecracking, pomposity-deflating humor that almost made you forget what a stalwart, unwavering friend she never failed to be. I know I am only one of many friends, colleagues, teachers, and patients all over the world who have reason to count themselves lucky to have come into Susie's orbit. She once claimed that everyone at her birthday party adored her because she had triaged out the non-worshipers. I'm not sure they could ever have made a quorum. I was surprised at rehab when she joined the pastor in reciting the Lord's Prayer, which seemed to give her comfort. My favorite liturgical reference from Susie's childhood was the release command when they taught their rescue dog to play dead. Resurrect! Please accept our deepest sympathies as well as gratitude for her beautiful life and the tremendous happiness you gave her. We will always be thinking of her with love and gratitude, with deepest affection and sympathy, Maggie and Al. An Shi Jian was from China, and Susan and Mark brought her into their home to help care for their children while they put her through college. And she writes, Susan lived such a full and expansive life that it is impossible to capture it in a pat description. And I can only say that she was Susan-esque. I had heard about Dr. Ho years before I met her. Somehow I had in my head that she was part of a distant and scandalous branch of my family by the last name Ho. When I finally met her, her not-so-Chinese-looking physique took me by surprise. After all, it was 1983 China. She was one of the first few non-Chinese I met in person. That was just the beginning of surprises. I was surprised and delighted by how welcoming Susie and the family were to me, a relative stranger. No formality, no false courtesy, but warmth, openness, and gentleness. Yet the same Susan could fight. When she was denied entry after China first opened up, she had fought back intensely and successfully, including writing to Deng Xiaoping himself. That's how Susan was, gentle, but with conviction. Of the many enduring benefits of having lived with Susan and the Molich whole family, more than safety and comfort are a model of family, loving, and mutually supportive, and the shaping of my own worldview towards progressivism. Susan always tended to have a different take on things. Living with her, I spent countless moments thinking, really? For instance, when I mentioned that I might have Jewish heritage, a Shion family inside joke to make ourselves more interesting, Susan very quickly started to work on me to consider becoming an Israeli citizen. Why? Because then China and between China and Israel, I would have 10,000 years of history to claim as me. Why hadn't I thought of that? Once I accompanied her to set up a temporary home for an Iraqi refugee family, an elite and educated family who was freshly traumatized in exile. Susan arranged to take the family to see an opera, or maybe it was a musical. And I thought, really? It seemed such an odd and impractical thing to do for someone in that situation. But reflecting on it, I wonder if that was not the very solve this family craved to cling to, a way of life with hope and beauty. Susan had so many accomplishments under her belt. There are many lofty things, but I also remember the smaller ones. I remember how she pushed herself climbing Mount Sinai by jerry-rigging a sort of tie around her injured knee to keep going. She wanted to speak Arabic and disciplined herself to study it. She was much more fluent than I was, even though I lived for many years in an Arabic-speaking country. How many people do you know who can recite Macbeth from heart? Susan was Susan because she constantly pushed and challenged and demanded. But surprisingly, she made the people around her feel good and not intimidated, maybe because she was never judgmental. Susan and the no one is quite like that Molich whole family has given me something to think about and cherish the last 30 years. I don't know if we can each become Susan, even if we try very hard. But I think we can all try to be more Susan-esque. Mitch Day is a Loyola medical student who served as a coordinator for the clinic in Bolivia. At the annual Aniversario celebrations at the Centro Medico Umberto Parra, CMHP, to us folks who don't speak Spanish, CMHP clinic, each of the 16 or so villages within the surrounding 50,000 patient area that the clinic serves come together for a day to celebrate CMHP's history, community, and future projects. One by one, each comunidad comes forth with an offering of sorts. These indigenous communities of patients, health workers, and town officials convene annually to both celebrate another year of life and to collectively offer gratitude to a sort of earthly trinity that comprises the original founders of CMHP. It is made up of Mark Molich, the omniscient father in all matters of endocrinology and burden of diabetes at the clinic. Douglas Viral, I'm sorry. Douglas, the quirky local Bolivian son on speed dial, who was always available in the flesh to resolve clinic matters. And Susan Ho, whose passion, altruism, and energy has been the driving spirit that initiated and sustained CMHP's mission of global health since 2001. Influenced by Jesuit traditions common to Loyola medicine, Dr. Susan served as the clinic's worldly spirit, doing her best to answer St. Ignatius's call to go forth and set the world on fire. Whether physically present at the clinic in her customary khaki pocketed vest, or from afar organizing donations to support patient care, it was apparent that she dwelled within CMHP's community of patients and volunteer providers. Her vision and altruism was the fountain of inspiration that started the clinic, long before its dirt road from the highway was paved with rock, and it will continue to guide and sustain the volunteers' efforts for years to come. Personally, it is no small stretch to say that the time I spent in Bolivia is always a gracious experience that changes me. Building kinship through global health with these rural Bolivian communities at the literal, geographic, economic, and social margins has radically altered my professional and personal trajectory and metrics of success. Similarly, the community of Loyola volunteers and the local Bolivian clinic staff remain among my most prized relationships. These ongoing gifts and many more unnamed contributions are left in the wake of Susan's incredible life. Let us not forget that her spirit lived on through so many lives that were impacted by her example of commitment, service, and love at Centro Médico Humberto Parra Clinic. Seymour Reichland, professor of endocrinology at Tufts New England Medical Center in Boston, said, "I weep for Susan, whose bravery and grit defied belief. Though petite in body, she was a giant in spirit. That is always as I remember her, and as I always will remember her. I have told many people about the wonderful things you and she together have done for others, and about her own personal gifts. I don't know how many times I have told the story about you and she in the Chinese restaurant when she ordered in Chinese to the horror of the waiters who had been making nasty comments to each other. About the young Chinese woman you took into your house so that she might get dialyzed to save her life when China had inadequate facilities. Her own dedication to her renal failure patients. Samuel Salzberg, nephrology colleague at Rush. I'm so sorry to hear about Susan's passing away. Just yesterday, I was speaking to one of her transplant patients who happened to be admitted to Rush, and we both expressed what a remarkable doctor and person she was. He mentioned that she had retired, and I recalled a previous conversation with her in which she stated that she could not think of stopping working because her health difficulty, despite her health difficulties, because she had to justify getting her transplants. Her perseverance and devotion to people literally all over the world was incredible. There is a Jewish tradition that the world has 36 righteous people without whom the world could not exist. I have always viewed Susan as one of these 36 righteous people. Susan can never be replaced, but the impact she has had on so many people will continue and will certainly live on through your wonderful family. Now, I have a collection of other comments that were collected by Roger Rudbury, a nephrology. I think I learned how to say it by now. Nephrology colleague at Rush and fellowship director. And I'm going to hold it because I sense there's a kind of restlessness. And maybe what we really need is have a thinning stretch. And so let's just pause for a moment, and then I'll pick it up. Just if you seriously, if you'd like to just stand up.